From pink patriarchy to policy, what happens when feminism stops asking better questions? Over the past month, we've been sitting inside a difficult but necessary conversation about feminism, what it built, what it broke, and who it continues to leave behind. We talked about the pink patriarchy, a version of feminism that looks polished, fundable, and institutionally acceptable, but too often replicates the very power structures it claims to challenge. A feminism that speaks the language of empowerment while quietly deciding which women are respectable enough to be protected and which are better managed, regulated, or erased. We traced how that plays out in real time. Who gets the mic? Who gets framed as a victim? Who gets labeled a problem? And nowhere is that tension more visible than in the conversation around sex work and trafficking, because this is where feminism has been forced to make a choice, or at least where it thinks it has. For decades, dominant feminist institutions have leaned into a narrative that feels morally clear and politically safe. Prostitution is harm. Trafficking is everywhere, and the solution is to eliminate the conditions by eliminating the work. It's a framework that photographs well, raises money easily, and fits neatly into policy talking points. But clarity is not the same thing as accuracy, and safety, especially institutional safety, is not the same thing as justice. At Swap Behind Bars, we've been clear about where we stand. Trafficking is real. It causes enormous harm. And it deserves responses that actually reduce exploitation instead of obscuring it. But when feminism collapses all sex work into trafficking, it doesn't strengthen its analysis. It weakens it. It trades complexity for control. It replaces listening with certainty. And most importantly, it starts solving the wrong problem. Because once you decide that the work itself is the harm, the policy outcome becomes predictable. Criminalize, displace, surveil, and call it protection. We've seen where that leads. Workers pushed further underground, violence that becomes harder to report, communities that stop trusting the very systems claiming to rescue them, and actual trafficking cases that become harder, not easier to identify. This is the quiet failure of the pink patriarchy. Not that it cares about harm, but that it insists on defining harm in ways that preserve its own authority, even when the outcomes don't match the intention. But here's the opportunity. If feminism is willing to be honest about where it has gone wrong, if it is willing to let go of tidy narratives and sit inside uncomfortable contradictions, then it can start asking better questions. Not just, is this work dangerous? But what do we do about dangerous work? Not just, who needs protection? But what actually makes people safer? And not just, how do we stop this? But what happens when we try? That's where we're going next. Because one of the most revealing ways to test a policy framework is to take it out of its comfort zone. If the logic holds, it should hold everywhere. If it doesn't, we should probably talk about that. So for the month of April, we're running a series of thought experiments. Each week, we're going to take a job, often one that is risky, precarious, feminized, or part of the gig economy, and ask a simple question. What would happen if we treated this work the way we treat sex work? What if we criminalized it because it's dangerous? What if we arrested the people who pay for it? What if we framed every worker as a victim, even when they say otherwise? What if we built entire systems of policing around saving people who never asked to be rescued? We're not doing this to be clever. We're doing it because when you apply the same logic to other forms of labor, something becomes impossible to ignore. The problem isn't that society doesn't know how to respond to risk. It's that we've chosen a completely different set of rules when the labor involves sex. And that choice, more than the work itself, is where harm begins to multiply. So before we move forward, we want to be clear about one thing. We are not minimizing trafficking. We are taking it seriously enough to question whether our current strategies are actually working. And if they're not, we're willing to imagine something better.